Hello. Andrea, are you able to see me? Oh, there I am. Great. Hi, my name is Elysa Voshell, and I'm the Executive Director of Minnesota Center for Book Arts. Thank you all so much for being here this evening or whatever time of day it is for you, afternoon, morning. Joy of being on Zoom and being able to connect from all over the world. To watch the recreation of a masterpiece, La Prose du Transsibérien, a documentary by Rosylyn Rhee about Kitty Maryatt's incredible project to research and recreate the 1913 masterpiece by painter Sonia Delaunay and poet Blaise Cendrars. We are so pleased to be able to host this screening and conversation as part of our presentation of Drop Dead Gorgeous, a traveling exhibition of fine bindings that is currently on view virtually at MCBA. For those of you who might be new to us, Minnesota Center for Book Arts is a community-based nonprofit organization dedicated to igniting creativity and community through the book arts. Through our studios, our artist programs, and our educational workshops for people of all ages, we preserve the tools and traditions of the book arts and connect contemporary artists to the arts of the book. We believe in the limitless creative possibilities of this dynamic and evolving art form and envision a world in which creative expression through the book arts is accessible to all. I have a few pieces of housekeeping about the program before we get started. As Andrea mentioned, your videos and microphones were muted, and we ask you to keep your video off and your microphone muted throughout the program. So that we can have the best viewing experience for everyone. And at the end of the talk, I'll be moderating questions from the chat. So feel free to put your questions in the chat at any time during the screening so that we can ask those at the end. I would also like to acknowledge that this activity is made possible by a grant provided by the Minnesota State Arts Board through an appropriation by the Minnesota State Legislature and a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as individual supporters of MCBA. If you like tonight's program and you want to help us make more of this type of programming possible, please consider becoming a member or making a donation to support our center. And now it is my immense pleasure to introduce Kitty Maryatt and filmmaker Rosylyn Rhee. Kitty Maryatt received a grant in 1981 to study fine binding with Swiss master binder Hugo Peller at the Centre del Bel Libro in Ascona, while she was getting her MFA at UCLA in graphic design. She studied with many fine binders over the years. Kitty was the director of Scripps College Press for 30 years, where she published 60 books that she made with her students who wrote the texts, made imagery, hand typeset, printed by letterpress, and hand-bound editions of 50 to 100 copies every single semester. Kitty's own artist books can be found at the Newberry Library, at Stanford University, UCLA, the Getty Research Institute, and Harvard University. Since her retirement in June 2016, she's been working full-time on La Prose. Rosylyn Rhee is an award-winning documentary filmmaker with over 2 decades of experience. Her independent films have screened at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, DC, and on PBS. Her work has been featured on KPCC Southern California Public Radio's Mental Floss and in multiple feminist film journals. And she was recently invited onto the season opener of HBTV to discuss her journey as a documentary filmmaker. After serving in-house as the in-house documentarian for the Music Center in Los Angeles, she continued her documentary work with organizations including the United Way, the California Arts Council, Alvin Ailey, Otis, and MoCA. Rosie graduated with honors from Harvard University with a BA in Visual and Environmental Studies, where she studied filmmaking, and upon graduation was awarded a Garner Fellowship to make a documentary in South Korea. In 2008, she won first place in Project Sunlight, an incubator for Korean American filmmakers. She grew up in Dayton, Ohio, and currently serves on the board of directors for Remix Culture. And now, please join me in welcoming Kitty.
Hello. So thank you very much to MCBA and all of the wonderful people there who've been working so hard to make all of this happen virtually, since we couldn't do it as we had planned originally in person. So thank you to Elysa and Tori and Andrea and Kinsey for being here today, and Anna, who's been helping me with the workshop coming up. I just thought I'd introduce the film by explaining how I sort of got into this and where it started. So it really started in 1987 when I found this, or I received this fine print issue that showed the Sonia Delaunay Blaise Cendrars book, gave the English translation, and also had a fold out showing all 4 pages of the book. I can't show it to you because it's too big. And it just knocked me off my socks. And I just thought, I need to know more about that book. And so I also wanted to know more what pochoir was, a stenciling technique that I knew how to stencil, but there are 1,000 different ways to stencil. Anyway, so I took a workshop in pochoir, so I knew about the beautiful brushes that you could use. And then in 1988, I went to see the original at the Getty, and that just raised so many questions in my mind, like why was it so fresh? It looked like it had been done yesterday. Did she do all of the copies, and how many copies did they do? And why didn't they finish the edition? And how long did it take to make the book? And was it because of the stenciling being so extensive that they didn't finish the book? And all of these things just raised my interest in the book. And so I also, meanwhile, started doing research by reading the Jean Saudet book, the only one that's really very extensive about how to do pochoir from that period of time. This book was written in 1925, but he was doing books for the previous 25 years in pochoir. And I knew that when I found Atelier Coloris shortly after that, well, maybe not shortly, I can't remember what year I found them, but I found them online by a mention by somebody named Paul Zwartries, who told me that they were the last remaining pochoir firm left in France who knew how to do the original techniques. And so I went to their website, saw that they knew how to use the metal stencils, and realized that they were the only ones who I could go to find out how this beautiful La Prose was done. And so I went to study with them in 2015, or work with them, I should say. And in the time that I was there, we made a facsimile of part of the book, just so that I could understand how would you go through trying to decide what color comes first and what are the techniques and how to do, cut that metal plate with what kind of tool, and cutting metal, oh my goodness. So that was a real eye-opener to work with them. And that's when I thought, gosh, they're the only ones in the world who could possibly make a new facsimile of this beautiful book. There were other facsimiles available. One was done in 2008, published by Yale University, of their copy, which I used considerably in my work. Anyway, so I found that it would be exciting if I could get some institution to make a new facsimile, but Yale had already done theirs. And so for a couple of years, I couldn't get anybody to do it. And eventually I decided that I would do it with the encouragement of Toby Schwartzberg, who you'll see in the film. And he helped me figure out how to raise money. So we raised $140,000 to be able to start the project. And so the edition was going to be 150 like Sonia and Blaise, but I needed to make 30 more for the underwriters. So it's really 180. So I'm still making them. I've made 120 of them, and someday I'll be done, another 60 to go. And so in 2018, I asked the underwriters to see if they would be interested in commissioning a fine binding, because they each got 2 books plus all their money back, to make a fine binding and have an exhibit of these beautiful books. And I wanted to be able to challenge binders. Being a binder myself, I thought that'd be pretty fun. And I was starting to make my own deluxe edition also. So we decided to have a traveling show, and that's what this Drop Dead Gorgeous is all about. And you can actually get a catalog from MCBA with a supplement, which is brand new. And you can get articles that I've written. So there's going to be something stuck on the chat so that you can get the most recent information about how to do pochoir in this book. And I decided that I would have to make a documentary about the whole process, because I knew that pochoir was going to be lost, the original techniques and how to use those brushes and why do metal and so on. So I asked Rosylyn Rhee if she would work with me to make a documentary about not only the process of pochoir, but the importance of this unbelievable book that was done all the way back in 1913. So Rosylyn Rhee is now going to talk to you about her collaboration with me on making this documentary.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Kitty. And thank you very much to the MCBA for coordinating this event so elegantly and making it so easy for Kitty and I to participate. I'll give you just a little bit about my background and the history of Kitty and I working together over the years and how it led to La Prose. Basically, I love helping people tell their stories, and that's how I became a documentary filmmaker. And I started, I've been making documentaries for over 20 years, and I make my own personal documentaries. And my main bread and butter for my work for about a decade was making short documentaries for nonprofits. So I started my freelance career in LA in 2007. And I started working with Kitty in 2008 when she was at Scripps College. It's an all-women's college. And I would help her put together videos that they would present at exhibits at the end of the semester. And as much as she is a very skilled artist and craftsperson, I really saw in the work that she did with these women was mentoring and coaching them. And that really spoke to me. And especially, you know, times are changing, but when I started freelancing, not a lot of people in LA were willing to give me, an Asian woman, a job directing documentaries, but Kitty always saw me for who I am and the skills that I bring to the table. And I'm so happy that I've been able to work with her all these years. So when she retired from Scripps, as was mentioned before, she had over the course of 30 years, she and the students and Scripps College Press had produced 30 artist books. So that is a tremendous feat of labor and coordination and artistry. So she approached me at that point to help make documentaries commemorating the work that had been done. So we made both a short documentary and a feature documentary, which I believe MCBA will make available in the chat. So after we did that, a few years ago, she called me and said, I'm working on a project. Can you help me document it? And I said, I'll be right there. So I didn't even get the details. I just went straight over because I knew it would be good. If Kitty's involved, it's going to be good. And that's something I consistently heard as I interviewed people for this project. Well, you know, if Kitty's involved, it's going to be good. And it's been such an honor to be part of this project. So in terms of La Prose, I think there are a few things that I wanted to share that really stuck out to me. And as the project blossomed, and as she said, it was clear that she was doing something special. And not only that, that it needed to be documented so we could have a resource for others in the future. And she's basically revived an almost extinct art form of pochoir. There's literally, you know, 2 people in France, and one of them is very ill, they're the only people we think maybe in the world, definitely in France, who know this form of art. And so Kitty went and studied with them, and part of the documentation was to get footage for other people so that they could get a taste of it, and so it didn't die out. I also see this recreation in art in the highest form in terms of making art for more people to be able to appreciate La Prose, which is really, you know, as all artists, what we hope to do is just to share the love and beauty that we get from creating. So my role was to really work with Kitty over the years to help her figure out the story and what we wanted to document, and you know, figure out what would be the visual parts of the story we wanted to share. And it really came down to preserving the academic portion and the artistic portion. So we wanted to make a documentary that both provided history of La Prose, context of the recreation, and some samples of what pochoir looks like so that it doesn't die out. In terms of the actual documentary itself, about half of the footage was shot by me and half shot by Kitty, which again, I think that speaks to her ability to pick up crafts so quickly, because she had watched how I had filmed stuff and was able to recreate a lot of my own filming techniques. And something I'm very proud of is, except for, I think, the interview with Marjorie Perloff, which was shot on a professional camera, all the remaining footage shot by both Kitty and I were done on consumer cameras. And I love that because technology has changed so much that it's just a much more accessible art form. So for all you documentary filmmakers, filmmaking enthusiasts, it's just a lot more accessible these days, which is very exciting. That's it. I look forward to answering questions at the end with Kitty, and I will hand it over to MCBA, who will start the documentary. Thank you.
So this is La Prose du Transsibérien recreation. Here's where the number is going to go. So now I'm going to fold it up again. And once the number's in, I also put the number in its little companion booklet. Here's the booklet. Here's a finished cover with a little note in it. And I corner rounded the edges so it'd be softened a little tiny bit. So it just freely goes into its cover. And so because it splays open like that, I had Decker Plastics make 180 of these covers. And everything should fit perfectly. And there it is. One done.
Sometime earlier this year, I was contacted about a project that I never thought I would see happen in my lifetime. A book that I've been passionate about for years and years is a book called La Prose du Transsibérien, text by Blaise Cendrars and illustrated with pochoir by Sonia Delaunay. And for me, it's always been a paradigm of the most beautiful type of livre d'artiste.
Many people have used it as a sort of example of perfection in the artist's book. It just brings everything together, the text, the image, the paper, everything about it makes it really the most desirable of all artist books. Of course, difficult to get hold of. It has come up for auction from time to time, but I was never successful. So eventually I managed to get it, add it to my collection, and of course it is the key to the collection.
I think it's one of those things that you can look at endlessly and it always gives you a different perspective, and it represents such a magical moment in 20th century art. So I think few things could few small things could give one such a massive pleasure.
I got my first job as a curator at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas. And as I was being toured through the building, not long after I started, I found out that there was an original of the book held at the Ransom Center. And that was one of those amazing moments of realizing I was not only going to be able to encounter an original, but I could teach with it and I could look at it whenever I wanted.
I was really interested in the fact that the pochoir was so fresh and looked like it was hand painted, and that there were 150 copies projected. And I just thought, what? How did they, hand paint so many copies? And then look at this construction, that you don't actually get to see the book until it's completely unfolded. So unfolded and then unfolded one more time, and then finally you get to see the book.
It's a funny object because I think if you thought carefully about doing this, and then the fact that every time someone looked at it, they would have to unfold it again, and then you were done, and then you would have to fold it up again. And even though it's on very heavy paper, it's just very stressful for that paper to have all those really flat, compressed folds. It just makes a crease, and then the paper fibers start to break.
The essential problem with artist books, there is a big problem with this art form. It's a wonderful art form. It's a hybrid art form, so it's literature and visual art. But the problem is, to experience an artist's book, you have to handle it. And for a museum, where I work, that's a big problem. We have these kind of priceless editions with original illustrations.
Take this out, don't open it though, just kind of open it a little bit, and then kind of go along. And then I'm going to do the bottom part. And see, and also it relaxes a little bit more. It just got slightly longer. And then here we go, we'll just drop it. But again, you can see that it's pretty hard to do this with two hands. And so that's the other thing about this piece. One of the questions I think that Kitty and I really like to think about is, who was this made for, and how was it intended to be seen?
So in Paris, in the teens, there was a lot going on, and all throughout Europe. That was the time when abstract art first was being created.
There's a big book that I refer to called 1913, that it's in 3 volumes, and it just tabulates what went on in that one pre-war year. The architecture was incredible. Proust published Swann's Way. Thomas Mann published Death in Venice. I mean, it's incredible what a year that was, and for the art, and Stravinsky and Kandinsky and the art. In that 1 year, you have Picasso beginning to do Cubism. You have just amazing work.
By the time Sonia Delaunay, a Russian immigrant, met Blaise Cendrars, who had grown up in Switzerland, these people were drawn to Paris the way a lot of artists in the 1950s were drawn, and still are drawn to New York, for example. That was where things were happening. And so that fortuitous meeting led to this amazing work of art, a hybrid work of art.
How did they come up with that format, those two, the painter and the poet? How did they decide to do this book together? It was like this super quick friendship when they first met at Apollinaire's house. Robert Delaunay, Sonia Delaunay, and Cendrars and Apollinaire, can you imagine, all together. And somehow Sonia Delaunay and Blaise just connected. And Sonia was already interested in literature as well as being an artist and a painter.
She was into everything. She did costumes for the theater, and they were off the charts crazy. I mean, off the charts avant-garde. I mean, she was avant-garde. And she did automobiles, she did boxes, she did women's wear, she painted. little known, but she was one of the best painters around, and she certainly had her own theories, right? Her own ideas of the application of color and how color should work. And so nothing was an accident. You're talking about a skilled, highly skilled artist.
And he said in that article, which made such an impression on me, most of the people that Americans think are modern are really kind of old-fashioned. Even Ezra Pound wrote in a kind of stilted 19th century style, and he was influenced by the pre-Raphaelites, and there's nothing really modern about it. And if you want something really modern, go to Blaise Cendrars and read, you know, the Prose of the Transsiberian.
When you open up this long book, you get this kind of simultaneity that she was going for with just her paintings all by itself. But the two together, looking at the text and the imagery sort of vibrating against each other, and even the colors seeping into the text. But you can't see the text real easily. It's tiny type, but you get this éclat, you know, this wow factor, where you look at the whole thing and you understand what they were trying to get at.
It's tour de force as far as the quality of the artwork and the ingeniousness of the creation, but it's also something that people will notice and see as a real change, either a strong right turn or a strong left turn in the course of art. How would you actually have the idea to make something like this? And then how would you actually do that? Because, as I think we all have pretty much confirmed, there's nothing else like this.
I did see a copy of it in the 1980s and asked the dealer how much it was, and he said to me in a very clipped English public school voice, 27. And so I left the shop in a daze, and I think it must have meant £27,000. So I tried to get my head around that, and I sort of thought, well, that's a book I'm never obviously going to own. So how fantastic to think that 30, 40 years on, somebody would write to me and ask me if I would like to make a perfect replica of this book, which to me is one of the books I've dreamed about owning and printing and working with for a very long time.
And it took me 20 years to actually come to where I am now, having done a lot of investigation and working with people in France and looking at many copies, about 10 copies around this country in France and England, to really see why it is that this book didn't get completed. The idea was that there were going to be 150 copies, and they didn't make it. And why didn't they make it? And so I was very interested in figuring out a timeline as to how did this book come together. Maybe that would give me a clue as to where it maybe fell apart at the end. And so I wanted to go through the whole process of making this book myself, trying to identify the typefaces, how would he have typeset it, trying to identify the colors in the pochoir, how would she have painted it. I sort of assumed at the beginning, before I knew it was even pochoir, I thought that she just did a painting 150 times. You know, thinking from a 21st century perspective, it was completely wrong. I mean, pochoir was a commercial way of reproducing artwork that was common and cheap. Maybe not literally cheap, but cheaper than regular printing.
I know how good pochoir is, so I knew that the Beinecke copy, the Beinecke Library at Yale did an edition basically of 2,000 that have sold out, and they presently sell on the internet around $1,500 for, you know, offset piece of paper, basically. They're wonderful, but they're nothing like this. And so knowing pochoir and having a copy of the Beinecke version, I was prepared to get excited because I knew what I was looking at, and I knew what it could look like.
What's remarkable about the poem is it's one of the first of what used to be called process poems, that it captures the actual process of the poet having an experience, and you don't know at the beginning how it'll turn out. Now, the typical poem, you can tell from line 1 and away, it's going to be about this, and then it has a conclusion. You don't know at all how it's going to work out, and it repeats and repeats and captures the rhythm of the train, and the little Jeanne, the little prostitute, and then she disappears completely, and he's all alone. So it starts out when he's dying to go, and he's an adolescent. And it is like a life journey, almost. He's an adolescent, he gets on the train, it's going to be great, we're going east, we're going to have these exotic adventures, and then it's not so long before you see, as I say, the train's coming back in the Red Cross cars, and people, and cut limbs, and blood, and you realize, wait a minute, wasn't this supposed to be a wonderful journey? But it isn't. And on the other hand, there are parts in it that are very joyful, so it's very complicated.
So Cendrars was a man who was a novelist and a writer and a poet, but was also very interested in art because he was immersed in the whole cultural scene that gathered in Paris around people like Apollinaire. And he was very much part of the milieu, so he met all the painters and artists. He probably spent a lot of his time going to private views. So he was extremely clued up when it came to looking at art and typefaces and visual things. So none of his choices were haphazard choices. They were all very informed, because he was a man who was visually highly cultivated.
It was amazing to write in free verse at this point. In France especially, poetry was very traditional. Poetry is written in Alexandrines. The Alexandrine is a 12-syllable line with lots of rules. So it's a 12-syllable line, usually with a break after the 6th syllable, and rhymes. So think how restrictive that is.
For a font that's a sans serif font of that period is already a modernistic choice, but to choose a font that's designed purely in italic is something that's quite unusual and very outrageous really for the time, because the way people were cultivated, they were taught that there was a whole series of conventions and traditions. So to actually put a title in a great big bold sans serif italic is a very important choice. And also the thing you do see in a lot of Cendrars' work is a choice of italic fonts, because italic fonts, sloping fonts, give an idea of movement and speed, which is also comes into futurism afterwards. And you see that, I think, as well in his other book, the Panama book. I think there's quite a lot of italic in that, and I think the idea is that gives a sense of speed and movement. So the fonts he's looking at, you could imagine in another context, like on the side of a coach, on the side of a train, on the side of a bus.
You know, cars had just come on the road fairly recently, and the roads were open. Don't forget, the roads were completely open. There are no traffic lights. There's nothing. There's nobody who's monitoring anything. And that's where the Transsiberian comes in. You didn't need a passport. Imagine what it was like traveling all around. So Marinetti could go to London from Italy, and Italy, of course, only became a country, a unified nation in 1870 or so. And by 1909 is Marinetti's famous manifesto, which sets the stage. And of course, it's very extreme. You know, war is the hygiene of the people, and down with the museums, and let's take Venice and, you know, fill in the canals.
So you've got something that looks Italian, something that looks German, something that's very American. So he's playing around with genres, and that's what's so interesting, is because the whole book is just a multi-layered choice of fonts that are all in their own way a reflection upon culture and art and nation, and about political ideas and movements.
That moment, the futurist moment, that moment in history is so fascinating. Even Dada wasn't that interesting, because Dada was anti-war, straightforwardly. There wasn't the conflict. When you think of how the technology changed overnight, ready-made clothes, just think about that, and Duchamp's ready-mades, and all the industrial things, and the advertising posters. And Cendrars has those wonderful, you know, comments on menus. It was the beginning of menus. Do you realize now we've gone the other direction? Now the worst thing you can have is a menu, and in every fancy restaurant, the waiter has to be able to tell you what the specials are and what's on, because heaven forbid you would read it just on the menu. But in that period, the menu had just been invented, and the idea of going into a restaurant and getting this printed thing, often with very lovely typography.
So he's very anti-elitist in his typography as well. So there's a very sort of democratic, you know, I wouldn't say communistic, but he's certainly breaking all the rules, and he's using typography that's commercial typography, which I think is a very interesting thing. He's not saying, oh, this is book art, and I'm making a fancy book with a famous painter, and people then would be looking very much backwards and choosing fonts that were Elsevier fonts, that were very Renaissance, neoclassical fonts. He's really doing something that, in a way, is, you know, quite down market, which is quite unusual. So he's saying, I'm not bothered about making something looking classically elegant or chic. What I want is to make it look like a living, organic part of this cultural period.
And you sort of feel that things were too exciting that war will come. And I sometimes think about that when you get a period where there's that much going on and that much sort of violence, and there are a lot of people who never had a voice before. They certainly didn't have a voice in art. The poor wouldn't have had a voice. They wouldn't have been able to have studios or have equipment or have anything. I mean, some of the Impressionists were already pretty poor. But earlier than that, to be an artist even, you had to have enough money, you know, to do all these things, and writers too. So they really weren't, you know, they were bohemian, but they weren't poor the way Cendrars was, who often really didn't have enough to eat.
And because of that, I'm just sitting on all conventions, and I'm choosing the fonts which I like, which are more to do with what you were finding in advertising design than you were finding in book typography. So this was a way in which he was also very audacious, and he was a pioneer, because all of his typeface choices are all really to do with things he sees in advertising design.
When I think about looking at it now, I mean, thinking about when I first started to know about that book in the 70s, it feels to me, in part because of its scale, that it is very much about a poster world, that its media identity belongs to the world of, you know, those fantastic color lithographed, I know it's post-war, but it has some of the qualities of those fantastic color lithographed posters of the late 19th century. And again, partly because, think about the Loie Fuller posters and stuff, they're so big. There's like as big as your body, right? It's like the dancers are bigger than you are, right? And there's something about the La Prose where there's this curious kind of tension there between the scale of it as something that you have to locate in physical space in relationship to you, while to read it you have to come close and be in a kind of reading relationship with it.
And that's the way technology is. I feel that way about technology today. Something gets invented like the internet and you think, oh, wonderful, email, wow, and look at the results today. Look at the results. So in that sense, this period is very important for us to understand, because technology always has two sides.
Because La Prose had recently come into Jack's collection, we spoke about that possibly being included on the exhibition. And after having looked at the work, I realized that it constituted in the poetry, as well as in the structure, a set of ideas for the way in which we might curate booknesses, which was slightly larger than the 96 exhibition, so there were 280 odd works. And to curate 280 odd works, we felt we needed a strong set of curatorial themes. And so Cendrars' poem established 6 themes. And I think the themes were visual verbal dynamics and color, which then worked not only between the Delaunay side and the Cendrars side, but also within the color blocks of the text itself. And then the journey. So the journey of the Transsiberian train created a set of geographical themes, locational themes, place, and structure we added to that as well. So journeys and traveling and place and space. And then coming out of the thematics of the poem were some of the more difficult aspects of the poem, which would be fantasy and the fantastic. And I'm thinking of that wonderful line, "The train always falls back on its wheels it always falls back on its wheels. And there's the sense of the fantastical nature of the journey. And the next theme was war, death, fear, apocalyptic imagery, which of course was a major theme of the poem. As the train traveled from west to east, so it got closer and closer to the Russian-Japanese War, and the apocalyptic scenes that they saw from the train windows became a strong theme. Also in the poem were the ideas of the poem, the poet himself unpacking his life, doubting his own craft, doubting his own abilities, looking across at the imagery and saying the words don't have the same impact that the painter has. And so there were these strong visual, verbal, and coloristic dynamics which were operating. But also in the poem, and because of the tedium of the journey, those fantastical flights of fantasy that the poet takes to exotic places like Martinique and to Timbuktu and other places. And then the last theme was sex, love, and the body, where he talks about his lost loves and his difficult relationship and relationships across spaces. And he moves and he jumps back to Paris and across to the United States, and then back again where the poem ends in the bar in Paris, and he goes home alone. So these created the thematics for me, 6 thematics. It seemed to me that Le Prose would be the #1 book on the show, and then those 41 books, historical books, would support Le Prose, some of the Russian and Italian futurists and the lettrist works and some of the historical works. And then that helped us segue into the postmodern works. I'm thinking of Hockney, and I'm thinking of Dine and so forth, and then into the 6 themes for the contemporary work. So in many ways, Le Prose created the curatorial key for the exhibition, and hence it was chosen, and also it's never been seen on the African continent before. So that was the opportunity to show it.
Created quite a stir in the French community, who kind of latched onto it and thought, this is nice for the French consulate.
How to look at this type. There are lots of different typefaces here. In the literature, Arthur Cohen said that there were 12 typefaces in this book. And so I always wondered about that. And so I started by making just a black and white Xerox copy. I've got 4 panels here. And I put a piece of tape on the side, and I started trying to identify the faces with just a number. And I did that over and over again. And by the time I'd have my 4th panel down here and trying to get them together, it was really hard to see whether or not this type was different from another type, because this was not the original. And I even had a copy of a book that had the whole poem in there with this original type. I just couldn't do it. So the long and the short of it was that I was able to go to the New York Public Library and put little pieces of paper all along. And then I got a graduate student that I grabbed, and I said, can you just help me here with this? And that was the key, because I was able to, after we got, at least a third of the way down, now we're getting a lot of more different typefaces. And are they the same as the first one or not? And so I would have him, we would find the same word. I'd take a picture with my iPhone. He'd take a picture with his iPhone. We'd put the 2 iPhones together and blow it up and see if we could figure out if that's the same typeface. That was really the key, that he was able to go, to the other end. I'd be at this end, trying to see. So basically, my conclusion is that there are 38 different typefaces, which is really pretty remarkable.
One of the interesting things about type and typography is that there has been all of these different shifts over time, from metal to wood and photo and film to digital type. And most people don't realize that the fonts, the typefaces that we have available on the computer today may not be all of the type that was available in metal. And so there are thousands of typefaces actually, and the record of those are here at the archive. When you look at the number of specimens of catalogs that we have, there are so many different typefaces that never made that jump to digital format. And most of them were of a specific time and period and style, and they just didn't stay in the catalog with a particular foundry or manufacturer, or they just weren't, they were lost. They were lost to time, and nobody thought to revive them into digital form. So when Kitty was thinking about creating something with digital type for La Prose, it meant trying to find these typefaces that may have only been available in metal. And that means there would be a need to find digital fonts that may have a similar style, or create something that was a revival of some of these older metal types. So there were several versions of typefaces in the original printing that were not available in digital format.
So then the question was how to get the print done. And so what happened was the Achenbach Foundation in San Francisco, Steve Woodall helped get from the Achenbach a high-resolution scan of the type. And then Richard Siebert, a printer in Berkeley, Richard went through and in the scan he got rid of the color so he could just take it out with the computer, and then he went through line by line, letter by letter, word by word, and cleaned up the type. So if you look at it, it's just beautiful. It's crisp, it's sharp, and it's real letterpress. You can feel the depression in the paper from the letterpress pushing into the moist paper when you print it.
The metaphor that occurred to me was turning buckshot into type, because a scanner, the art museum wanted a scan of the entire book, and they did it at what they think of as high resolution, which is about 300 dpi, which is good for photographs, for color work, etc. But for doing letterpress printing, you need 1200 dpi. You need a much higher resolution, otherwise your eye can see what are known as jagging. In fact, every letter of this poem was gone over. I essentially traced out the type by hand and mouse finger. Some areas more intensely than other areas. Sometimes there were no counters in the east, it just looked like a blob. Well, as you stare at different typefaces, you gain what I call a sensitivity to the letter form. You sort of know where that letter wants to go, how that letter wants to look. You remember what previous instances of that letter look. And you start to get to see, oh, well, this can get shaved off a little here, that can get shaved off a little here, oh, this wants to slope a little bit like that. I would say a good 30% of the type I wound up tweaking at that level of detail.
She's really the modern woman. She's, you know, the Renaissance woman who in all these difficulties that she went through, she had a lot of difficulties. She just kept on going. So, you know, so I just like June Wayne and other people that I admire, Beatrice Wood, you know, women who lived a long life, who were accomplished in spite of everything, who also had families to deal with and everything. You know, they're my models. You know, I want to be like them. I just love their life stories.
She's still very much with us. And people still emulate. When you see her, it's not dated stuff. When you see her work, you don't know what period it's from. It could have been yesterday. For all, you know, I mean, it's just fabulous, fabulous, brilliant stuff.
This is like a little clutch purse. And that's, Sonia did do textile design as well. And so this great thing, this great way of holding it that she designed for this very difficult to hold and unfold piece, it works, you know, the couture mode of, you know, like this, like this. Think of fashion shots of purses. This is it.
She was like Picasso. She just had to paint. And if she wasn't painting, she had to help. She did portraits of Philomene. She did people dancing semi-abstractly. And she was always a color person. She really got into the Fauvist movement where, you know, the really bright colors that were unnatural. So to see her show at the Tate Modern, seeing her early paintings really informed me as to how she got to her Transsiberian imagery. Her earlier colors with her more traditional kind of painting were more naturalistic and not so wild, but she slowly got wilder. And so by the time, you know, she got to 1913, she was into pretty much full abstraction, even though this has got the Eiffel Tower on it and the Ferris wheel. That's really the only figurative imagery in there. And so this just seems like right in her oeuvre, you know, it has all of this movement. There's always a lot of movement in her work. It's not static. There's rainbows and circles encircling each other because of the lights that she saw in Paris that were brand new, and she has all these influences.
If you looked at this without the color insets, it would be much less interesting, way less interesting. But it looks, and I guess that's the whole idea, that was Sonia Delaunay's whole idea, it looks so spontaneous. So it's such a great trick that she made this. And also she had to do it that way because she wanted versions that were pretty close to being the same.
What's interesting about this book that I'm doing is that it's a translation of what she did originally. She originally did an oil painting. And then, in order to go from the oil painting to the edition, she made an intermediary step. So she went from her oil painting and herself did a gouache. It could have not been done. She could have just given the oil painting to the pocheurs and said, okay, now you do your tracings of this and interpret how to create a copy of this. But she did the gouache painting of her painting, which was really informative for me to see step 1, her painting, step 2, her gouache, and step 3, the edition. And so I studied really hard the original painting to try to find out, did she really have those two colors distinct, or were the colors melded together on the original oil? In March 2014, I discovered an article on the internet that mentioned the last remaining pochoir company in France, Atelier Coloris. I saw from their website that they knew the techniques used in 1913, since they had worked at Jacomet, the venerable pochoir firm. Having received a faculty research grant from Scripps College for the summer of 2015, I worked with Nathalie Couderc and Christine Mengy at Atelier Coloris. I realized immediately that they were the only ones in the world who could make a facsimile of La Prose with actual pochoir, not a photographic reproduction. That's when I took Nathalie to meet 95-year-old Myriam Cendrars, the daughter of Blaise Cendrars. By January 2017, I had launched the recreation project and planned on having Atelier Coloris do the pochoir, hoping that I could be a lowly assistant. but Natalie unexpectedly had surgery for a brain tumor and could no longer work on the project. So in June 2017, I went with my assistant, Christine Youngling-Niles, to start the pochoir under the supervision of Christine Mengi. The edition was planned for 150 copies, plus 30 for the underwriters.
Alors, pourquoi faire du pochoir? Quelle est son utilité? Eh bien, lorsque nous avons commencé, nous avons découvert une technique très belle parce qu'on travaille sur des beaux papiers. Et en fait, l'intérêt, c'est de reproduire en petite quantité. Le minimum, c'est 50 exemplaires. Et à chaque fois, on fait une pièce unique. Nous approchons le plus possible du modèle, de l'œuvre à reproduire, dans la couleur surtout, et dans la forme bien sûr. Très bien, et on reprend là-bas, voilà, et on descend. Non, alors, là, une minute. Hop, voilà, on essuie un petit peu sur le bord. Très bien. Là, il y a des manques. Il en manque, là. C'est bien, ça. À part là, c'est pas grave. C'est pas mal.
Ce travail que nous faisons est comme si nous étions avec un vrai artiste qui fait son œuvre et les couleurs que nous faisons dans le travail est le même travail que le peintre a utilisé. Par exemple, nous avons fait un travail qui s'appelle on a utilisé les mêmes
oui, Matisse.
Métis.
I think it's fantastic to be able to have a facsimile of this most unusual book. And there are facsimiles out there. They're out of print. You can't get them anymore without paying an awful lot of money. And even my recreation is going to be expensive. So why do it? I think that I really want to be kind of like the June Wayne of lithography. I want to revive pochoir as an active artistic technique that can be used in a modern way in bookwork today, because that's what I'm interested in as a book arts, but could be in other kinds of, posters and so on. The simple idea of pochoir is you're colorizing some printed thing, but pochoir in itself is such an expressive thing that you can do, even though you have a hole and you can't go outside the hole, but no, you can. You just pull that plate right out of the way and you go do outside of the hole. So it's that being able to have a repeatable area that you can make an addition, but also expand it so that you get an expressive thing that represents the idea that you want to express. So I think it's really because I've always enjoyed pochoir and liked pochoir, and I saw the possibilities in the Sonia Delaunay piece and Blaise Cendrars piece that I'm not sure that everybody has seen.
À 18 ans, Nathalie a commencé à travailler dans un atelier et tout de suite, elle a été passionnée, elle a très très vite appris, elle a cherché toutes sortes de travaux différents et elle est restée passionnée tout le temps, encore maintenant.
Oui. Et je passais des heures dans ce travail que j'adore, mais hélas, j'ai dû arrêter puisque je ne peux plus pour l'instant, je dis bien pour l'instant, ce travail, j'espère qu'un jour je pourrai refaire du pochoir. Voilà. Mais c'est un travail tellement beau. Pour moi, c'est le plus proche d'une reproduction par rapport à un original. Oui, exactement. Voilà.
Alors maintenant que que nous avons un petit peu abandonné le pochoir, eh bien, il faudrait passer la main, comme on dit en français, former peut-être des gens qui seraient heureux d'en faire un métier et de le faire évoluer. Pourquoi pas? Place aux jeunes.
So I want to show you how I started analyzing this book to see how I could reproduce it. I was always just interested in it for myself, not for making a recreation for other people. It was just part of my research into trying to find out why Sonia and Blaise didn't complete their edition of 150 copies like they thought they were going to do. So I just started drawing it, tracing everything that I saw, mentioning overlaps or very confusing things in this kind of half moon area, and eventually giving them numbers. So the numbers were the colors and the order in which they were going to be painted. So here on this right-hand side, I have my list of colors, starting with light green, then light orange. Normally you go from light to dark, but there may be reasons why you don't do it exactly that way. One reason that I didn't always do it that way was that the evidence showed on here that one color, even a light color, was on top of a dark color. And that causes problems because as you're swirling around with the brush, it could mix the two colors together. So anyway, it's a lot of analysis. This one was really confusing about which one was the pochoir stencil and which one was free brushing. So Natalie and Christine didn't think that there was a lot of freehand brushing in general in pochoir in 1913, except maybe to do skies or seas. Usually it was done with a stencil, and you'd see the hard edge of the stencil rather than this soft edge of the brush or these kinds of things. So that was part of the analysis, trying to figure out how to make it look like Sonia's original painting. I also did, as part of the process, a series of the progressive prints, they're called. So you'd have page 1, page 2, now we've added yellow, page 3, we've added green, page 4, now we have a bright yellow, and page 5, this one shows that the green is on top of the yellow, and that we've actually taken a brush and with a water in it and smudged that so that it's not so harsh. You know, and doing all of these, I'm thinking, why did they do that? And so I'm pretty sure that Sonia must have told them once they made the plates from her gouache maquette that maybe she wanted them to soften certain areas and make it look more painterly, because this looks like basic stencil, except some strange things are going on here. Now, when I first started this process, before I did the Yale facsimile, I had gone to the Getty Museum and was looking at their colors. So I have a whole list of all these different colors from different institutions. So here are all the colors of my 18 colors from the Legion of Honor in San Francisco. Here are my colors from LACMA, my colors from the Getty, and I kept on going back to refine the colors because it's pretty hard to figure out the colors from memory. You can't do it from memory. So I painted gouache, selecting a basic color, thinking it'd be close to the ones here, and then I added white or I added black so that I would have a series of colors, so I could take that green and put it right down next to that green and say, okay, it's closest to that color there. And that way I'd have a possible recipe for gouache, but in partnership with this, because this doesn't have an infinite number of colors, you really need an infinite number. In partnership with this, I actually also used my Pantone color chart, which you use as a printer. So I would put on this list all my Pantone colors, and then I would make a facsimile, then I would take it to the original, put it next to the original, and see whether or not it was accurate. And if it wasn't accurate, then I would make new swatches. So here I would make a whole number of new swatches. Then I started painting them right at the edge so I could take this light green and let's see if this light green is accurate. It's actually a little bit better down here, but it's a little bit blue. So then I would add a little bit water to see if it looked better with the water, and that way I could refine the colors, but I would do it with the original rather than with this Yale facsimile. And so my latest colors now are these swatches, which have the Pantone color on them, and then showing also any extra brush marks that I suddenly discovered. Like on this one, when I did the facsimile for the Zamorano Club, I didn't realize that there was a darker area down here. So that added one more pochoir run to get the darker color right there. And so each one of these has, you know, notes to self. Like here, this little brush was a freehand brush rather than part of the pochoir. This is an offset printing plate. This is the sensitized side. And this has the right kind of stiffness in order to hold all the little tiny pieces when you're doing the stenciling. I got this from Agfa. It's 5.5 thousandths inch thick aluminum. So the first thing that you have to have is some kind of a cutting mat to go underneath it. So you can see that this is kind of a flexible piece of rubber. This is neoprene rubber, and it's 1/2 inch thick, and the durometer is 60, although I have another piece that's 65 that we actually used the 65 durometer in France, and that means the squishiness of the rubber, and that's so that the knife can really dig into this rubber and push through that aluminum, because it's not like cutting paper where you just pull like this to cut paper. And so I have a piece of bacon here, which I keep in the freezer, and this is used to make the tip of the knife slidey. So I go in here every 2 seconds and get a little bit of bacon fat or pig fat on my tip. So we're plunging in and pushing and sliding it back. This one's going really well. Sometimes they're very stubborn and you have to pull the knife out and it doesn't want to. There, when I get to the very end, I just plunge in so that I'm actually literally cutting at, you know, maybe a 1/16 of an inch back from the tip rather than from the tip like you would with paper. So now I just turn it around so I can usually, you know, carve it towards me. So just go back in, get it nice and juicy. And so why is the metal better than acetate? You can control the seepage of the wet gouache underneath the edges a lot better. You don't have to use a dry brush. So you can do washes, you can do things that you can't do very easily with an acetate stencil. But can you see, I don't know if Rosie can get this, but I'm plunging in and out, pushing forward, pulling back, and pushing back with my index finger of the other hand. So when you're done with cutting all of these things, then you're going to put it on your piece of marble. You fill a beautiful wine bottle with lead. This is lead shot, and stuff it up. So that's pretty heavy. And then you're going to roll this over. So here we go. I don't know if you can see, Rosie, you know, how kind of bumpy and funny that is. Right? And now I'm going to roll it and then I'll show you again. So I roll it in all directions. And actually, when I was at Atelier Coloris, the table was a little bit lower, so you could use your body weight on it. You turn it over. It's a lot flatter now. And then every once in a while I see maybe like a little baby mistake I made right there, so I can go back in and cut that off and re-roll it if I need to. just tap it around the edges. In France, we had an amazing hardened chunk square of pig fat that was kind of slightly dried out that we used. So this is my way of figuring it out. And then you'll use a brush that you will only use for this fat, and you'll swirl this around to even it out, because you don't want this to get onto the paper, which it doesn't because it's a fairly lightweight layer of it. And that is going to help you keep the color from sliding under. So that's, maybe the most important thing I learned besides how to cut the metal, is how to keep that color from sliding under. So it's your French pochoir brush. And here's a slightly bigger one. And then we have little ones also like this. It comes in about 8 or 10 different sizes, and Talus carries 5 sizes. I asked them to carry them for all of you who want to learn how to do this. So this is slightly domed, so really what touches the paper is this area on the end here, but all of this holds the gouache so that you can do this maybe, if you're lucky, 4 or 5 times, especially if you have a small area. It's just all a matter of learning, again, what Christine calls a lot of the time. She says it's the gesture. You got to learn. Your hand has to be flexible like this. You're not doing your arm work like this. It's really moving your hand. Your arm maybe move around, but you're moving your hand like this with a very flexible wrist and a very, very light touch. So sometimes if you kind of forget that you need to be light with this color, you get a little bit heavy duty, and sometimes it'll be a little darker than the last one you did, or maybe you'll go over one more swirl and it's a little darker than the last one, or your model that you're trying to match. So there are a number of things that can go wrong that are surprising. what happens is that the colors, when they're light, are easy to do because they're real liquidy. And especially like yellow is like a dream. It is so much fun to do yellow. You just go, you are done. It doesn't leak underneath there, and it doesn't have streaks. These are the things that can happen. And other colors, oranges, lovely, anything kind of based on these yellows and oranges. Then as they get darker and darker, the streaks, you have to overlap them a lot so that you can blend them so that they look even. So the darker the color, the grittier the pigments get also. So that one of the hardest ones are these medium to dark blues. So by the time you are getting to the dark colors, you already have a lot of figures on your image and trying to fit it in so that it fits in the right position. You've already solved that. But now if it's touching, like sometimes I would have a light color overlapping a darker color. Now gouache is water soluble. So if you have yellow on top of green, there's a little green edge over here. If you swirl around, here's the green edge, if you swirl around like that, you can just draw the green right into the yellow, which means now you have yellow-green at that edge. So you have to watch out for that. So you have to go towards that direction and keep on pulling yellow out from the rest of the brush. I got him. Okay. That's my little piece I've taken out. Here's the little gray edge that I can see now. I see the green's fine, and right down here I'm going to take off a little tiny bit right there. This all fits really well. This fits beautifully. It's all fitting. Little tiny bubbles in there, which means I'm going to put in a little bit more. I don't know if I'm going to do more fat, but it's maybe the brush is just a hair wet right there. And then down here, that's overlapping nicely, maybe right at that corner. It could be a little bit better. And maybe I could do something about that corner intersecting into the orange, but that corner needs a little work. There. It's a deal. So, oh yeah, I got to take off that purple.
Part of appreciating an artist's book is tactile. There's no substitute for using your hands, you know. The digital editions that we're producing give you the contents of the book, but they do not give you the tactile pleasure of experiencing that book, that's missing a big part of it. What Kitty's edition is doing is giving that back to the reader, to the appreciator of this, to the experience of the book. And you are able to unfold this the way it was originally produced. You're able to read through it. You're able to see the imagery produced in the same way. There's a big qualitative difference. As great as that Yale edition is, and it's wonderful because it put that book in the hands of so many people, the experience of handling it, and it's really in its original form, with the impression of the type, with the feel of the paper, with the vibrant colors of the pochoir, is a qualitative difference, and it's kind of a big deal. Yeah.
I have a wonderful pastel that's about 4 feet by 5 feet. Pastel, you don't usually use pastel 4 feet by 5 feet. That's a lot of pastel, but this is of a woman in a swimming pool, and it's just wonderful. And it was done by a student. When I was president of CCAC, I bought this thing from the student that I ran into, and it's just wonderful. I've had it in my life all my life, and it adds to my life. You know, it's part of having a thing of beauty is something that I love, and I hope the people who end up with this feel the same way about it.
My husband's an engineer, and they used to have this mantra, continuous measurable improvement. So I've never forgotten that. So here I am, making it better and better and better until it just can't get any better. And I'll be very happy.
A lot of people thought when we digitized works of art, or they thought when we made facsimiles of things, that would make them less interesting. But I think that makes it much more inaccessible to people, because when they come to the original, they are really wowed by it, because they understand, having looked at the facsimile or looked at reproductions, you can see the difference, and it helps you understand why art is important. I'm really interested to see it, to see Kitty's version of it. Most of it is such an incredibly ambitious project. I don't know the edition, actually. I'm interested to know how many she's planning on doing.
I think she's planning on doing 150.
That's crazy. That is crazy.
And with, actually, I think it's going to be 180 because there'll be 30 oars to commerce. I'm not considering it.
Oh my God, she's crazy.
Hello. Wow, amazing. Even seeing this for, I've watched it previous to this screening, obviously, but seeing it again, just I feel like I continue to learn new things and just continue to be wowed by this project. I feel like Marcia Reed's statement at the end about the number in this edition and just the tremendous ambition of this project and the passion that Kitty brings to it is just incredible. Kitty and Rosie, can you turn your cameras on and join me for some Q&A? So again, if people have questions, please put them in the chat. We're going to be kind of triaging the questions, and I'm sure lots of things will come up for everyone. I have a few that came up for me. First of all, I'd love if you two could talk a little bit about your process working together in making this film. It's almost like you have two ambitious projects here, an incredible edition of an artist book, or three, maybe, like the research piece, the reproduction piece, and then the film. So I'm wondering if you can speak a bit about what that process was like for each of you.
Well, Rosie, you should talk about that because you were the one who was going to be editing everything. So talk about how we work together.
Right. So good question. Kitty and I, we've worked with each other for over 10 years. So we have a deep foundation of trust. And also I respect, there's a lot of trust. So she had gotten interviews when she could, because a lot of the people that we needed to capture, I mean, they're like in South Africa and France and England. So what we did is we tried to figure out, okay, how can we equip Kitty with equipment so she can go and multitask additionally as she's, presenting her book at these major book fairs. And then she would go and grab like Jack and the other gentleman, David, I think, and, ask them to say something on camera. And then she would also have me come and I think over, I feel like 3-4 years, you would have me come in at specific times where, Kitty and I work together long enough that she has a strong sense of story and how I work, and then just have me come in and say, okay, I really think let's spend 6 hours and make sure we get like 5 or 6 of these elements. And so then, it was a lot of capturing footage and then a lot of sitting down and talking to each other and, wrangling out what's the story, what do we want to be sure to capture. And I think we kept coming down to making a resource so other people really understand just how special La Prose is and why this project is being made.
Yeah, what was interesting about starting this process, I just wanted a record of how this book was being made at first. And I thought this could turn into something like a documentary, but I thought, a little video here and there isn't going to do it. You got to kind of tell the story of the book. And that's what started happening, is that we realized we needed more and more interviews. And, that really stemmed from the videos that we had done before, because Rosie did the documentary for the Scripps College Press, and where we interviewed the students. I had started the project several years before. I had been doing interviews. Rosie did some more interviews, and using the students' voices to tell the story. I just thought that was really the way to go on this documentary, that I wasn't capable, or who would want to listen to me talking about this book all the time. It's all these people who have known this book for years and years, and experts and people with different experiences with this book. A curator's experience is different from, say, a bookseller. And so just to be able to see this book from so many different points of view, and from an academic point of view too, I thought was really one of the ways to go on this. But I didn't want to lose the techniques, but I didn't want also for the documentary to be all technique. I still feel like I need to make a pochoir video that's really just dedicated to technique, because it takes a long time to learn to do it right. You can learn how to do it. You can learn how to do anything badly. So those were the discussions, that we kept on hitting on. Maybe 3 or 4 times we would have a face-to-face or a telephone conversation asking each other, which way do you think you want this to go? And so what Rosie brilliantly did as an editor was to balance these things, you know, some of the technique with a lot of the explanation of what the book, why the book was important. Why did I get latched onto this book? It was purely visual. You know, I was just knocked out by so many aspects of it from the very beginning. And it was never my intention at the beginning to make a reproduction of it. I just was curious about it. And why didn't they finish the book? And, you know, what is this pochoir that doesn't look like stenciling? You know, it looks like fresh painting. So all of those things just kind of dragged me into the book, but I was teaching full time. We were making a book every semester. We made 60 books over the semester, all the 30 years that I was there. And so I lost my thread of what I was going to say about the film that we just saw. Anyway, I'll leave it at that because I don't.
Yes, I'm sure we'll come back to it. It feels like, you know, it kind of that the project evolved and that it kind of sucked you in over time and became bigger and bigger. I thought the way that the film had all these different perspectives on the book made it just so much richer for me. I've seen the copy, the first time I saw it was at the Beinecke, and I was just blown away visually, and I don't read French. And I thought, you know, having Marjorie Perloff's perspective as, you know, an expert in poetry, and then other people who's, you know, the kind of the collector perspective versus, you know, the maker perspective versus all of these different approaches was just really rich. And I felt like I learned so much about the book and its importance through this film. So
I think the fact that it's in French does make it more like this beautiful piece of artwork behind me that my son did. I'm so proud. But, you know, you can't read that. You don't know what that says, but you react to it as a work of art, as a gesture, as something that is beyond what you know. You don't understand it yet, and you want to know more about it. So the same thing happened. Now I read French, but still, you know, when you first see this artwork, Sonia Delaunay completely took over this artwork, right? You see her first because she's big and colorful, and Blaise Cendrars is smaller, and you have to work at it more. Whereas with hers, you just dance along with her, moving down the screen, so to speak. You know, it's almost like watching a TV, and, you know, kind of darting back and forth. So it's a completely different experience that they would have had back in 1913 to view this book. And so to kind of wrap up why they didn't finish this book, I was so curious about, was it World War I that just stopped production? Because they started, they met in January of 1913, and in August of 1914, the war started. And so what happened in between there? So Blaise hadn't even finished his poem. And so Sonia couldn't do anything, but once they met, you know, and became fast friends, and he had lived in Russia for a while, so he spoke Russian, so they could speak Russian together. So, and he was very interested in their ideas of simultaneity and the contrast of colors and so on. And how could you capture that with words, you know, that same kind of simultaneity. And anyway, so she couldn't do anything until he finished the poem. So it took several months, you know, maybe into March, where he was still working on the poem. And now they had to figure out, well, now that we have the poem, what are we going to do with this? His previous 2 books that he had printed and published were both his poems that were done in one typeface, flush left, you know, straightforward. And the second one, Séquence, was even being typeset and printed at Imprimerie Créteil in just south of Paris, as he was working on this book with Sonia. So she couldn't do anything until he was done. Now he's done. Now he's going to go to Créteil and get the book typeset. but how do you do the design of the book? So here's the great unknown. How did they, as Marcia said, how did they do that? How did they decide to have this big, long, unusually formatted book in 1913? There was nothing like that. So my theory is that he went to Créteil, probably to look upon his printing of séquences, and he was starting to get it typeset. He didn't typeset it himself. It's this firm, Créteil, is a huge city block. It's huge. It's got hundreds of employees. It's got, dozens of different kinds of printing presses and so on. Lots of cabinets of type and monotype equipment and so on. So it's not exactly known how he started, but here's how he could have started. Like any book, most books, you would set it all in one typeface. And that's exactly what he had done on the previous two typefaces, books that he had published. And so he could have started out on the monotype machine, for example, and just had the book typeset. One doesn't know how he suddenly got into 30 different typefaces, one of my opinions is that he saw the banks of types there, and there was a book. In fact, I have one, a type book from Créteil, which was their in-house book, which listed all the typefaces available to you. So he could have been inspired by the fact that he could do it in different typefaces. Why would he do it in different typefaces? So it's really unknown how the typesetting went, but he would get proofs of the type as it would come off of the typesetter's equipment, either by monotype or by hand typesetting. Those things would be called galleys, and they would be long, narrow pieces of paper like this, because the pages wouldn't have been broken up yet. You just wanted to make a proof and see what it looked like. Well, once he got that first page, I'm thinking, that he might have thought, well, my goodness, I don't have to break this type up into parts. I could just let it go all the way. And then Sonia Delaunay wouldn't have to do different vignettes to go with the parts of the book. She could do a painting, which is her forte anyway. Mm-hmm. And how would she do the painting? Well, once they got all of the proofs, they could do copy fitting to see how long it would be. And then she could do an oil painting. And that's exactly what she did. A long, narrow, 6.5 foot long by about 14 inches wide paint. In fact, narrower than that, because this is, what is that? 7.5 inches wide or so. So it's 7.5 inches by 6.5 foot painting is really unusual proportions for her too. Although she did do a big painting that had something like those proportions. Anyway, so how did they get it folded down into this little tiny thing that could be carried around? And that's where everybody says it's the map fold. And so they would have Paris maps. I even have a Paris map right over on the corner there that unfolds in this way, exactly this way. So they could have seen that tourist map and said, oh, well, we can fold this thing down. But first they had to think about the length of it, so the shape, like the scroll, I think had to have come first. And then, oh, geez, we've got to make this into book form and fold it up somehow. So the map could have come into play there, because if they had started with the map, then they wouldn't know where to put the pieces of the puzzle, so to speak. Where would they put the poem on this unfolding of the map? Because a map is like one big, huge area. So anyway, I think it's a combination of the map and then seeing the galleys as they would come off of the press that gave them the idea to give this really unusual format. And because of this unusual format, the collectors of books at that time in 1913 were kind of stunned, like, what is this? This is a book? Now we think this is, of course this is a book. We're 2021, but in 1913, books were codices. It had a fold, it had signatures, you could sew it together and so on. They didn't have these crazy things like we have now. So my opinion is that it didn't sell well. And therefore they couldn't keep on paying Créteil to do the work. So the work would go this way. First, they had the type. They didn't have to break it up into pages. They could just set it all on one long page, but that would be very impractical on a printing press. So they divided it up into 4 different pages so that they could fit onto a printing press. So they'd print the first page and then they'd print all the pages, and then the pochoir would be done. So all the printing had to have been done first. So my theory is that all 150 copies of the book were printed at once. I have never found a copy that doesn't have any pochoir on it. So I'm assuming that they tossed all of the ones that didn't get pochoir. So now the materials are taken to the pochoir room. So Kaite had a pochoir, a group of several pochoirs, 9 pochoirs, at least in 1925. And they would have tackled doing the pochoir. And they would first have to do a maquette. They'd have to first, work with Sonia Delaunay's model in gouache and do the tracings and cut the plates and so on. And then they could start the process. And the process would be this way. They would take one plate and they would put it on over their edition of 150 pages to be in color red. And they do all of those. It would take a day or 2 or 3, maybe, depending on how complicated it was. And they do the pochoir for all of those. But that isn't what happened. They only ended up with about 80 copies. So I've been working on a census to try to figure out where are they, if I could find that out, but also did they, what existed at some point for sale. So anyway, so I think that they would have been paying as they went, and they is not true. It was he. It was only Blaise who paid for this. Sonia didn't put any money into this game. So Blaise was in charge of selling the books and getting everything produced. So, and his mother in her book about him actually wrote that he did not get an inheritance, that he told Sonia Delaunay that he was going to pay for the book because of this inheritance. He borrowed the money from his girlfriend. So there was a finite amount of money. So I think they just ran out of money because the sales weren't heavy enough to be able to keep on doing the work. I don't know that as a fact. I just think that that's the closest possibility of all the possibilities I've thought of. So that would have been way before World War I started, because they weren't selling all that well. This unusual book that never even got any publicity except for ancillary questions. So that was what really first got me. The 2 things that first got me when I saw the book in fine print and at the Getty was, look how gorgeous it is. It looks so fresh. How could that be a stencil or a series of stencils? And why didn't they finish it? Why did, and how many are there? Nobody exactly knew how many there were. They thought there were about 60, but I've been doing the census, and they've been doing a census in Geneva. And we're getting pretty close to thinking that there are 80 or 82 distinct books, but it's complicated because Blaise Cendrars didn't number the books sequentially exactly. Like there are 2 copy 111s. There are 3 instances of double numbers and, gaps in between. So lots of curiosities about this book, which, keeps one always interested in it. And so you can take a lot from it, as you heard David Patton speaking about the themes in La Prose. It's just a really rich experience to see this book. And that's why I wanted to do this edition, so that people could see it and ask for it in a museum or a library or a teaching institution and not have to touch the $500,000 book.
There's a question in the chat about the kind of physical integrity of the book and the challenges of opening it. So the question is, the film commented on the challenges of maintaining the physical integrity of this book format with its fold, and especially the long spine and the folds against the grain. Did you consider this in your recreation in any way to increase its durability?
Yeah, it was, that's, when I saw the book in Paris at Jacques Doucet, where was it? it's some museum. Anyway, the first time I saw the book on Japanese paper was a revelation, because not only was it beautiful, it folded up perfectly without any stresses. And so they did this book on 3 substrates, 8 of them on vellum. Imagine trying to fold up vellum, impossible. And 26 of them on Japanese paper, and the rest on simili Japon, which is a Western fibered paper, which was thicker than the Japanese paper. So of course, the thicker paper, anybody who's ever folded a paper in fourths, you know, in half and then in half again, you notice right there's a little crinkle right at that corner. So yes, of course, I had a lot of thinking and researching to try to find the right paper. I absolutely could not find the paper that matched the color, which was sort of a grayish cream color, the original simili Japon. The Japanese paper, I found an exact match in Japanese Gampi paper, but when I did the pochoir on it for tests, the fibers would come up too quickly because you're swirling around, not in the same place, but you're moving pretty slowly around the whole so that you're overlapping the strokes. And so when I see these copies on Japanese paper, one of which is in San Francisco, by the way, that's the only one in the United States that I know of that you could see, you wonder how these, you know, expert pocheurs were able to do it on Japanese paper. So what am I going to do? So I really tried hard to try to find a Japanese paper, because I thought that's the way to go. You know, that Japanese paper loved being folded. But the Western style fibered papers, they're not such long fibers. And so when you bend them over and it's a fairly thick paper, it's like, let's see, 145 grams per square meter. And so my paper I decided upon was finally going to be a commercial paper that I could buy, rather than what in my fantasies would be to make the paper to the exact, you know, to the exact color and thickness of what would be required. But then how do you determine amount of sizing to put? So, you know, it was just like, and how long is this going to take? And the cost.
But you seriously considered it, right? You seriously considered making
Absolutely.
the paper?
Not me making it, but you know, there are fabulous paper makers who, just like binders, everybody needs a job, right? Give them a job to do something fantastic. So yes, I did consider it, but I looked at all the papers that I already knew, and I looked at all the papers I didn't know. And the one that finally fit the bill was Reeves Heavyweight, which was 175 grams per square meter. And I knew that it would be folded and refolded and, you know, unfolded and refolded. But I just felt like, because this was going to go into libraries and museums and individual collectors, that they wouldn't treat it like a wild thing. You know, they'd be careful opening it and so on. But the fact is that you can't see the book until it's completely unfurled, like a flag, sort of. You know how the flag is folded up. You can't see the full flag until you've got it undone. So you need a 6.5 foot table. So it's a completely impractical book from every single aspect of it. You know, that to show it, you need to hang it on the wall, really. That's another way that Sonia, I think, subverted this book and took over the book in a way that it's not easy to see, even if it's, you know, laid out 6.5 feet long. You have to walk along, you know. But there are pictures of Sonia and Blaise sitting around with the book draped over their bodies, you know. So anyway, that's all I have to say about those things. But I found this paper, and I sent 10 different papers to Atelier Coloris to evaluate for me, because I thought, I'm not experienced enough to know in the long run if this is really a good paper or not. So of the 10 papers, they rejected a few of them outright and said that this was one of 2 or 3 that were going to be acceptable for pochoir. So the problem with any paper is, because of that swirling, as I mentioned, especially with the fibers in the Japanese, it's going to pull it up. So if you stay too long, even on Western paper, even if it's thick like Arches or Reeves BFK, for example, you know, a 300 gram per square meter, really thick paper, just loves pochoir. You know, Atelier Callery used that almost exclusively, Reeves and Arches. So to use this thinner paper was a compromise, but it still wasn't as thin as it could be. But that was my best choice. And it was still very expensive. Everything about this project was very expensive.
Speaking of part of it that was probably expensive, there's a question in the chat if you can talk about all the various bound copies of the book.
In the world of the original?
I'm not sure if the question is asking about I think maybe it's asking about the fine bindings that are in Drop Dead Gorgeous. And I'm assuming that that's what the question is. And if that's not, and it's your question, put a clarification in the chat.
Okay, so the question is, how many fine bindings are there, basically?
They said, please talk about the various bound copies of the book. So I think maybe they're asking if you could talk a bit about the fine bindings that were made.
Fine bindings. So I went to my underwriters who got all their money back that they had loaned me and got 2 books. And so I said, well, you've got an extra book there. It's in my binding. So my binding was this, you know, to copy the original folding pattern and the vellum cover, except I had 2 folds in my vellum cover instead of 1 fold, like the original vellum cover. But I asked them if they would be interested in commissioning a binding for their own collection. And so I got a response from several of them, and several of them bought more books from me so that they could have more fine bindings to collect in their own collection. So it just blossomed that way. And then I got some more binders to bind it to. And then I did one. And so that's how we got to 25 of them. And of those 25 binders, most of them got the book in sheets, which means that it's just in let me just see if I can pull out one page so that you can see that's one sheet of paper with all of the edges still on it, with all of the center, the little crop marks and where you would cut it down. So each one would get 4 of these, page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4. This is page 4. So the binder, I told them that they could fold it up and crop it any way they wanted. But then I said, here's my document that I'll give you. Here's the way that I did the edition. Here's how I folded it. You can do it exactly like that if you want. Or what was really the inspiration for even asking my binders to my underwriters to commission these bindings was a Paul Bonnet binding that was done in 1963-4, I think, of a book that he had gotten in sheets, and he folded it so that it was not the small 3x7, but double tall. So about 3x14, 3.5x14. So he bound it that way. And I thought, oh, well, I'll mention that to the binders, that they are not required to do it exactly the same way. Plus, you could also do it double wide and double tall so that you wouldn't have so many folds and that you could look at it sitting down. And it wouldn't ruin the idea that Sonia and Blaise were really strong on the idea that you could not see the imagery first. You could not read the poem first. You couldn't see anything until it was completely unfurled. And so would folding it in a different way ruin that message? And that message had to do with this simultaneity that I talked about in the film that Blaise adopted for his purposes in the book also. So anyway, oh gosh, I lost my thread of thought. So basically I gave them permission to fold it any old way. So all of them did either the original folding or the double tall or the double wide double tall, and one did it differently. Midori Kunikata Cockram, she did it differently. She was the only one who kind of dared to be, doing something different. So that's how all those bindings came about, was that I was so lucky that the not all of the underwriters, but several of the underwriters supported this idea that this show would be really unique in the sense that you've got 25 different bindings of the same book, and how you could see kind of the binder's mind. How did they think about doing this book, especially when you realize after seeing this film what all the themes are and how juicy and interesting it is. And that's what I wanted, was for the binders to have a challenge, because they're almost always given a book in sheets in codex form. So what are they going to do when they're faced with this and they have to glue it together and cut it down? Or possibly some of them got the edition already folded. So that was what I thought would be really exciting for the binders. And being a binder myself, I thought, what am I going to do for this show? And that's when I came up with my deluxe edition, which ended up being not a single book, one of a kind, but I'm doing a number of deluxe copies with an aluminum cover, which harks back to the aluminum used for the pochoir plate. And so now you see why I have 25 of those. And then the number of bound books that exist, those 80 books, it's really a confusing mess, because many of them they're all supposed to be folded the same way, but they weren't. So some of them have 18 folds, 20, 21, and 22 folds, which tells you that they weren't even all folded before the war started, that he was getting various binders after the war to complete the edition, and that they were folded funny. Many of them, well, the binding was simple. It was folded and then put loosely into the vellum cover. So now it was interesting to find out how many of them still have the vellum cover and whether or not they attached it. So the original ones were glued. The book was glued to the vellum cover so that it wouldn't go away. That had a little tab hanging out to do that. But they've always broken off in all of these museums and libraries where they are kept. And so I just decided there's no way I'm going to glue mine to the cover. It's just too awkward to open it up and have that thing flopping around and just ripping the page off. And so there's only one fine binding that I know of the book, and that's the Paul Bonnet of the original. That's the Paul Bonnet. All of them have been left the way they were intended to have been left.
There's a few questions in the chat, and if you have, we're going to wrap up soon. So anyone who has final questions, let me know. There's a couple questions that are kind of practical about the pochoir process, and I think the part in the film where you talk about, reviving pochoir as an active art form, I think very successful, at least in this group, in terms of all of the questions and engagement. And you gave a demo for us a few weeks ago, and people were on fire. So I think there's some budding interest in this process out in our Zoom universe. There's a question, do the pochoir brushes have to have a certain density of bristles? And did you have to take into account the color left over on the edge of the stencil, and would the wet gouache pick up the dried color on the edge?
Yes. So the pochoir brushes were the ones, without a handle on them, are really, how many of those bristles do you think there are on there? I say it's 5,000 or whatever. You can do stenciling with any kind of brush. You've got Japanese brushes, you can pound, you can swirl, you can use spray paint, you can stencil any old way. What I was interested in was the way that they did it for La Prose and all of the other fashion magazines and so on. And so there wasn't anybody except Atelier Color when I finally found them to explain, why is this brush so big, and why do you have a smaller one, and when do you use them? Well, you'd think that with the bigger brush, you'd use it for the bigger hole, and that's true. But the brush, being that big, holds the liquid longer. So you could use for regular stenciling, a small brush, you know, little regular brush, or you could pound it. But that's not traditional French pochoir. They use these brushes from the beginning. And so that's why I was interested in reviving this idea of being able to use a big brush for contemporary people, making books who want to do something beyond the hard edge stencil, because a stencil's easy to do. You know, with a dry brush and a piece of acetate, you cut a hole in a piece of acetate and you don't make your brush too wet and you swirl around in there or plop it or do whatever you want to do. And you can put color onto a piece that has already been printed, or you can put color onto, you know, just color and make your own artwork. But the point is that that these brushes hold the liquid for a long time, so you don't always have to go back into your little puddle and recharge it every time. So that's one thing. And you'll notice too that there's color just on the end of the brush. These haven't been washed because I might have used them yesterday. So if I'm going to use them today, I'll just kind of, you probably can't see the dust coming, the gouache dust coming off of it, but I can reuse this today and not have to wash the brush and, you know, let it sit overnight and hope that it dries the next morning. That's a lot of drying to do. But anyway, to talk about the edge of the stencil, if you're going to do more than 2 or 3, you are going to have buildup around the edge of the hole, because you're not going to wash the hole every time. You're going to just keep that, you know, the whole point of doing pochoir is to do multiples. So you're going to do multiples. And as Natalie and Christine said, you're going to do at least 50. Minimum.
I love that they said a small number and then they said at least 50.
Yeah. Well,
does not seem like a small number.
Yeah, Blaise had an edition of 1,225 books called La Fin du Monde, and he had pochoir all over that book. 1,225 copies. I've never counted how many pages have pochoir, but let's say there are 20. Just multiply those two numbers together. So basically your plate is in metal because it'll hold up forever, almost. And that it will, if you've got lots of little ins and outs, that they won't bend, and you can cut them easier than on the plastic, in fact. But the color on the edge absolutely builds up. The darker the color, the more you get it, you know, thick and dry, especially here in California. So you have to wipe off those edges. Depending on the color, you have to wipe it off maybe every time. And also when you turn over the plate and you've already put a little bit of fat on the back of the plate and swirled it around so it's very, very thin so that you don't get it on the paper, you do that every single time, not necessarily adding fat, but you use your fat brush, which is basically a ruined pochoir brush, and you wipe that down every single time. So when you have a light color, let's say a beige, as you build it up and it dries around the edges a little bit, it's going to pull in darker color. So you're going to change the color. So with the lighter colors, like beige, you have to wipe it every time. With the dark ultramarine blue, for example, absolutely, you have to wipe. You may get away with 2 or 3, maybe sometimes 5, depending on how big the hole is. But usually you have to wipe that down. But with other colors, like with the yellows and the oranges, which are like dreams, you don't have to wipe down the edges, you know, maybe once or twice in addition of, I would do them 30 at a time. I don't do them, I didn't do, well, you can see that I'm not done. So I do 30 at a time, 30 of page 1, color 1, 30 of page 1, color 2, 30 of page 1, color 3, till I get through the first 19 colors, say, and then I'll go on to page 2's color 1 and so on. Anyway, yeah, the color does build up. There are lots of little niceties that you will discover as you try to do it yourself. And you know, the most important, as I said, was the gesture, that you have to learn how to go around the hole. And anybody could go around the hole like real quick like. And that's what most people who start with pochoir do. The hole is, let's say, 5 inches tall and 3 inches wide, and they'll go around the edge and wonder why they see all these swirls when they're all done, because you have to overlap. You can't allow all those streaks to happen. So you have to learn the gesture. Each hole is a different shape. Might be long and thin. It might be little tiny thin at top and then explode to a big melon on the bottom. So the way you approach the hole changes every single time you have a hole. So that's what we were learning from Christine and Natalie. First, I worked with Natalie, you know, and then unfortunately she had her terrible brain surgery and still can't use her hands to do this, but she means to get back to it. But she let me borrow 50 of her brushes because otherwise it's so hard to afford that. I ended up with 66 colors, about 20 base colors, and then tints of all those colors. So I have all these different brushes that they loaned me, plus a bunch of my own. So I am so grateful to them for everything. So everything I ever do is dedicated to them. And this article that I just wrote, you know, has their names in the title of the article. So, you know, I'm indebted to them, and so is the world indebted to them. And I want people to know, you know, how wonderful they are and what great training they had. In other words, you know, Christine, was it Christine or Natalie? I think Natalie, no, I think it was Christine who said it took her about a year to feel comfortable that she could do pochoir without having the maîtresse stand over her and, you know, make sure she was doing it right. So as I said before, anybody can do it badly. So if I'm going to teach a workshop, I want to make sure that people understand that you use this brush with green only. You don't wash it out and then use red. Those are the standards. Therefore, you have to have a new brush for every corner. That's $150 right there. You know, it's really, it's something that not everybody may want to do. And I have known people do wash their brushes and then use another color. And pretty soon your brush is brown, which is fine unless you want to do yellow. And then it kind of leaks out into the yellow. So, so I feel conflicted about teaching pochoir because it's like learning gilding online. Try to do that, or paring leather, or, you know, whatever, skateboarding. So it's hard, but, you know, you got to get started. You got to make your mistakes and find out what works and what doesn't, and, you know, get together with each other and find out. And then just to see, when you see a beautiful page from a fashion magazine from 1910 or 1911, and you think, gosh, they did 500 of those and there's 16 colors on that page, one of many in this magazine. Now you appreciate it. And that's why I put some of those images in the show from Atelier Colory and from the fashion magazine. So once you start doing it yourself or start appreciating and learning about pochoir, you know, you're just amazed at the skill and technique of these people who could do anything with pochoir. Absolutely amazing. And their task was normally to copy a work of art, not to make it up from scratch with the brushes. That was the commercial aspect of pochoir. And so what I'm hoping, of course, you know, these people who want to do a workshop, they're not going to want to do this commercially unless they do it for their own books, you know? So there will be those who say, I've learned pochoir, and then I say, what kind? With the spray bottle, you know, with airbrush, or with stippling, you know? Pochoir is just the word for stencil. So you have to say, I'm learning traditional French stenciling. Then I know you're using a metal plate. And of course, later on, they did use the plastic plates years later, and you just have to use a drier brush. You can't make it so wet. But you'll understand it better. Once you try it yourself, you'll say, oh man, boy, look, how did they do that?
There's a question about the plates, actually. Someone asked, do you know how difficult it might have been at the time of the original printing to obtain this very thin aluminum sheet? And what other industries would have demanded that same material?
They did not use this printing plate from that time. They used zinc. And the zinc sheet was zinc sheeting for roofs of houses and for flashing. And they had these big, huge machines that were as wide as half a city street that would go to a central area in Paris, and all the pocheurs would go there and they'd make the sheets and then roll them away with them. So it was mostly zinc, but they also used copper. They did use aluminum, it existed then, but they weren't the offset printing plates then. So today, so what happened was that the zinc was no longer available in Paris or in Ploubazlanec, where they have their business. The zinc was no longer available and they had to find a substitute, and they tried the plastic, you know, mylar or frosted mylar and so on. They said it just wasn't working for the kind of detail work they were doing. And so a friend of them who was a printer suggested, well, the printers are using this aluminum plate. And so they tried that out and they could get a thin enough one. So it's 5.5 thousandths inch thick, which is about the thickness of the mylar that you would use, but it lays really flat against the paper. However, Natalie and Christine tell me that the zinc lays flatter against the paper because there's lead in it. Zinc's made out of lead and tin, I think. And so they always loved their zinc, and they even gave me a piece to look at and play with. And I've looked at it and I've measured the thickness and so on.
Was it softer to cut than the aluminum? Is it softer to cut than the aluminum?
With
zinc?
Yeah. Yeah, the aluminum's nice and resistant, and that's why you use the rubber underneath it that has a sink, you know, that's soft enough that your knife can plunge into it. If you try to use a hard cutting mat, like the normal cutting mats we have today, there's no way you could cut that aluminum. But also they used copper a lot because copper was, of course, a lot more expensive than any of the other metals. And there's a fabulous stencil at Princeton that I discovered in their archives that they didn't know that it belonged to Jean Saudet. So I had ordered it up saying, oh, you have this stencil. This is the first one I've ever seen, the historic stencil. And they said, oh, well, I think it's just a flower. And so when I got it and looked at it, I said, that's Jean Saudet from his 1925 book, from the Deluxe Edition. I mean, it was like mind-blowing to see this thing in copper. It was about, the live area was about 5 inches by 7 inches, and it had probably 1,000 cuts in it to make this flower. So copper was used for really detail work, or if you were going to do 1,225 copies, you know, you need that thing to last for forever. So I've had to remake plates from time to time when the surface of aluminum will oxidize. So I have to spray it with a lacquer spray in order to keep it from oxidizing and getting kind of white powder on it. And sometimes the very edges will chip a little bit. So I have to respray it or just cut a whole new stencil. And you saw me doing all of that sanding. You know, at the beginning, the things didn't fit all that well. And so that was the continuous measurable improvement, is that I just had to keep on working so that the print looked better. I don't think they did that with the originals. You know, they were a lot freer than I was able to be. I felt like I was trying to copy all of that gesture, but I couldn't do as free as they were. But I did a good job, I think. But I admire the work that they did. And I don't know how many pushers worked on this. If there was one pusher, you know, I mean, it's taken me years and I'm not done. But of course, I've had other things in between. But I don't know how many pushers, but ideally you'd have 4. One would work on each page, you know, and there was usually the master pocheur who would mix the color so that you would have it be the same every time. If you gave every pocheur, you know, you're doing page 1 red and you're doing page 2 red, and you're not sharing the bottle and you're making your own, it's going to have some difference. And by the way, as I went around the world to find, you know, originals and take my color swatches there and see what red is it that I really should do. You know, some of them were slightly more orange and some of them were slightly more pink, but I finally settled down and I thought, I got to use the Getty colors because that's there. or, you know, the Yale facsimile was printed. So those colors aren't true. So I just had to go back to the Getty and LACMA, luckily they had just gotten a copy, and see if I could come to a conclusion about which red would I mix and then make my own swatches so that I would always have that same color.
There's another question about the stencils. How many were necessary for the recreation?
I did 93. And so each stencil might have one hole on it, but some stencils, you know, would have 3 blues or 5 blues. Yeah, so I cut 93 stencils, but the first stencils that I cut, I recut all over again. There were 19 of the first ones. You know, they just weren't good enough, and I was getting better. You know, you just get better as you learn to cut. And so I redid all of those, and that was like, oh, this is a lot easier to do the pochoir now, because I didn't have little messes. I knew how much liquid to put in the brush, you know, because you can, just like any old painting, you know, you can put too much in the brush one time, and then the next time it's a little bit too dry. You have to go back and get a little bit more, and it's totally unscientific how much you put into the brush, you know. So trying to make an edition where all of the colors are the same intensity and the same hue is what pocheurs do. That's their job. And so that's what I was trying to do too, is to be as faithful to the original as possible. And the only color I had a difficulty with was the pink, because the pinks fade quicker than other colors. And so trying to pin down which pink, which was, you know, is it this vibrant or is it this pale? That was one of the harder colors for me to pin down. And the hardest colors really to actually do in pochoir is the ultramarine. It's the most rich and gorgeous blue. It's like lapis lazuli, you know, it's really blue, but it's gritty. And so even if you make it thin, now you've lost your intensity. So you have to make it a little thicker than your normal kind of skim milk. I mean, that was the interesting thing to me when I went over to Atelier Kellery in 2015 and saw the thinness. When I had been taught in 1988 or so, when I took my first workshop, that the gouache was fairly thick, not real thick, but a lot thicker, and that you put it on just sloppy wet. You don't put it on really dry, like I was taught with plastic, with Mylar. So anyway, that was so interesting. I'm thinking the cost, you know, each tube of gouache is like $10 to $15, depending on its permanence and so on. And, you know, you're squeezing it. Well, I've done gouache all my life, you know, and you're painting little tiny things, you know, but with this, you'd squeeze out practically the whole tube into a jar and mix in water so that you'd have at least 3 or 4 inches of it, thinking, oh, this is going to cost a lot. So I had to, you know, before I started this thing, I thought I wanted, you know, a museum to do this, but then I thought, okay, no museum's going to do this, and Toby's going to help me raise money. How much money should I raise? So I had to make a big budget to see how much this gouache would cost. How much would I pay Atelier Kellery, which was the original idea, and how much would the vellum cost for, you know, 150 copies plus 30. I needed, I don't know, 80 skins or something, which is a huge amount. So anyway, everything was like risky on this project. But you know, that's just what you do in life. You take the risks, you make intelligent risks, as you hope. And this project has just grown to, you know, I didn't have a binding show envisioned. I didn't think I was going to do a deluxe version. I just thought, gosh, it's going to be hard enough to do a regular version. So it just keeps on growing, and then having these wonderful interactions with people who are interested in this, who, you know, if they didn't already know about this La Prose, now they're just going to be more fascinated to see what they can, to learn more about it. And that's why I shared the articles that I've written about it, because you just can't find information about how to do pochoir or how to interpret the things, the prints that you're seeing in the fashion magazines or later prints like Matisse's Jazz. That's all pochoir. Why did he do it in pochoir? He did his original cuts on paper that had been brushed with gouache, so that he had a perfect match with Linell gouache. So that was, why he chose to do that labor intensive process instead of, say, silkscreen or, regular offset printing or something. Anyway, it's just totally fascinating to me. And, I've had a long life and made a lot of books with my students, and I retired in 2016. I would never have been able to do this book and all this work without having time to do that. But I have a family, I have a husband who I get, he doesn't want to do any pochoir. So it's, life is just always a balancing act and taking risks and just soaking in as much information as you can get and doing your own artwork.
Well, on that, I'll ask you each a final question, which is what, I know, Kitty, you're still in the middle of finishing the edition, but what each of you are working on, what you're working on next.
Sure. So I'm working on 2 documentaries, and one of them is a feature about CTE in the NFL. And then the other one is about the social justice of arts education in Los Angeles.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this, but this was like a beginning. This is just one chapter, and I told Atelier Kellery that they have to write this book about pochoir because they're the only ones who could do it. So I told them that in 2015 when I first met them, and they went, "Oh, no, we can't write it. No. So I said, okay, I'll write it and you correct it, right? I'll get it started so that you don't have to feel like you're writing it." So maybe that would be the next step, is to have them correct all the things that I'm doing incorrectly, or to help me understand. I looked at this Man Ray book called Rotating what's it called? Rotating Pages or something, that was done in 1916, 1926, 1923. Oh, I forget right now. Anyway, it has this one little tiny thin line in there. And then at the bottom of one other page, it has like 5 little tiny lines that are in 4 different colors. And I'm thinking, I know this book was done in pochoir. How could they possibly have done that tiny line? Now, that with the fashion plates and so many other pieces of pochoir, they'd print a print first in collotype that's called the keyline base. So I think that that's how they did it. But how am I going to tell? So I got to take my loop to, Revolving Doors is what it's called, by Man Ray. So there's so much that I don't know. Because they're not at my elbow anymore, watching me do it, have I just gone off and done something where I've not done the gesture right, So what I'd really like to do is to go back and live with them again. And, I really would, and like to ask them all the questions, like here on this one, how did they do that with the brushy, that it looks like you had to do it freehand with a brush, and you told me you thought that they didn't do that back then, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot for me to learn. But really, the whole point of me always learning anything in my whole life has been to be able to make my own artwork. So almost all of my artworks have been one of a kind. I've done one edition of 15 books where I did a lot of painting and so on. So, I'd love to be done with this project so that I could see what I'm going to do. I really want to see what I'm going to do because I have lots of ideas, but I get to do things for friends. Neil Albert is one of my underwriters, and he sends to all of his friends, he sends a flower every week, starting at the beginning of COVID. He sends a digital flower. And after several months of these digital flowers, I said to Neil, who lives in New York, you have to do a book. And I want a poster. I want to see these big, printed. You should have that on the wall with big Neil Albert on that. So I did that for him. And we're just getting the miniature book because he's a miniature book guy, which I didn't really, I guess I knew it, but somehow it hadn't connected that he wanted to do this as a miniature book. So I've done this miniature book for him, got a Shakespeare quote that seemed right and put it all together for him. And we're just getting it printed right now. And he's thrilled to death. So, it's really great to be able to work with people who've done something nice for you, because he was one of my underwriters, you know, supported my idea. He had no idea who I was. Somebody else who was my underwriter told him that this was happening. He said, oh, I want to be in on that. I want to support this effort. So, and I want to make things for my granddaughter. I have a new granddaughter, you know, so there are lots of things that I want to do. I want to make my own books and, you know, live life, go traveling with my husband again. And so that's what I'm doing.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much. Thank you to everyone who's here tonight. And the program is recorded, so we will have that available. And thank you to our sponsors and funders who help make all of our programming possible. Thank you all for being here, and have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.